Lena's hands trembled as she placed the tray on the table. It was just another busy night at the small diner on the corner of Oak Street. The usual hum of clinking silverware and the sizzle of the kitchen filled the air. It was a Tuesday, nothing special. She adjusted her apron, wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, and glanced at the clock. The evening rush had begun, and the restaurant was filling up fast. She turned to grab a coffee pot from the counter, the familiar motions grounding her. She had been working here for the past 3 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The customers were mostly regulars, people who didn't ask for much and were easy to please. The job wasn't hard, but after a long day of running errands, it was exhausting. She was used to the routine. Everything was predictable. Until now. The bell above the door rang, signaling a new customer. Lena didn't pay much attention at first, new faces came and went all the time. She smiled and greeted the man who had just entered, her voice warm but weary. "Table for one?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room as she made her way toward him. The man nodded, his features partially obscured by a dark hoodie. He didn't seem to stand out, just another person looking for a quiet place to eat. But something about him made Lena pause. The way he walked. The way he moved. There was something familiar in the way he held himself, but Lena couldn't place it. Maybe it was just her tired mind playing tricks on her. "Right this way," she said, leading him to a table by the window. She wasn't looking for trouble. She had a job to do. Lena set the menu down in front of him and stepped back, ready to leave him to decide. But as she turned to walk away, something stopped her. She couldn't explain it, but her eyes kept drifting back to him. The man had removed his hoodie and was now staring out the window, lost in thought. His posture seemed familiar, as though she had seen him like this before, sitting in the same spot, thinking the same thoughts. But she didn't know why it felt so unnerving. She shrugged it off and turned back to the counter to grab her next order, but then it hit her, the feeling. The recognition. The realization that sent chills down her spine. The man's face. She had seen it before. She couldn't breathe. Her heart began to race, each beat louder in her ears as a rush of memories flooded her mind. The face staring back at her from the corner booth was the same as the one she had last seen 7 years ago. Lena's legs almost gave way under her. She felt the ground beneath her shift, as though the entire room was tilting to one side. She blinked, hoping the image would fade. But it didn't. The man was still there, still looking out the window, completely unaware of the panic coursing through her. Lena forced herself to walk back to the table, trying to steady her breath. Her heart was thumping wildly in her chest. And she had to swallow hard to keep the tears from welling up in her eyes. She had never seen this man before, at least not in this diner, but the way he looked, it was him. Her husband. The man who had died 7 years ago. The man who she had buried, mourned, and rebuilt her life around. How was this possible? It couldn't be. She must have been seeing things. This was some sort of cruel joke. But no. She wasn't mistaken. The face, the eyes, the way he carried himself, they were all unmistakable. She reached the table and stood there, her body frozen. Her mind was whirling with confusion, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of fear. She couldn't bring herself to speak. Her throat felt tight, and her words were caught in her chest. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't even know why she was asking. Was she trying to pretend this wasn't happening? Was she trying to stay calm, to convince herself this was all a misunderstanding? The man turned his head slowly and looked up at her. His eyes locked onto hers, and Lena's stomach dropped. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared into the same eyes she had once looked into every day. The same eyes that had filled her heart with love, the same eyes that had once been full of hope. The eyes that had closed forever when he had died. But they were open now. He smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible. But it was enough to send a shockwave through her. "Lena," he said, his voice deep, the same voice she remembered so well. "It's me." She couldn't move. She couldn't think. She just stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with tension. How could this be possible? How could he be alive? The sounds of the diner faded away, the chatter of customers and the clinking of silverware becoming muffled. All Lena could hear was the pounding of her own heart, beating like a drum in her chest. Her legs shook as she fought to stay upright. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. The man looked at her with an intensity that made her stomach turn. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stare at him. His smile faded, replaced by a look of understanding, as though he knew exactly what she was feeling. He didn't seem scared. He didn't seem confused. He seemed calm, almost as if he were used to people reacting this way. "Lena," he repeated, his voice softer now. "It's really me." Her mind raced. This wasn't possible. He couldn't be alive. She had been to the funeral. She had watched them lower his body into the ground. She had felt the weight of his absence in every corner of her life. But here he was. Sitting across from her. Alive. Her vision blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. She could barely keep herself together. "How?" she finally managed to croak. "How is this possible?" The man's expression softened, and he reached out as if to touch her hand. She flinched, pulling her hand back instinctively, but he didn't seem hurt. He just watched her, waiting. "I know this is hard to believe, Lena," he said. "But I need you to listen to me. There's a lot I need to explain." Her mind screamed at her to run. To escape. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. But her body didn't obey. She stood there, paralyzed, staring at the man who had once been her everything. "Explain?" she finally found her voice again. "How do you explain this? You were dead. I buried you." She couldn't finish the sentence. Her chest tightened, and the tears started to fall. She didn't care who saw. The man's face softened with empathy, and he leaned forward. "I never wanted you to go through that, Lena. I never wanted you to think I was gone forever. But I couldn't come back. Not until now." She shook her head, desperate for answers. "But why now? After all these years? Why are you here?" He hesitated for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice low and serious. "Because there's something you need to know. Something you've been kept in the dark about for too long. And it's time you heard the truth." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Lena felt the room closing in, the walls narrowing as her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. The truth? What could possibly be the truth? What could he possibly say that would make any of this make sense? And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man stood up. He walked toward the door, his back to her, and before he left, he turned and said something that made Lena's blood run cold. "You don't know the full story, Lena. But you will. Soon enough." And with that, he was gone. Lena stood there, shaking, staring at the door. The diner had gone silent. No one had seen what just happened. No one knew what she had just experienced. Except for her. And she knew that her life would never be the same again. Lena couldn't shake the image of him. She sat at the counter of the diner long after the dinner rush had ended, staring blankly at the empty chair where he had sat. Her mind refused to accept what had happened. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But the memory of his face, the one she had buried along with him, lingered in her thoughts, a constant, haunting presence. Her hands were still trembling from the encounter. The strange feeling of his voice, his gaze, the smile that had once been a source of comfort, now twisted her stomach into knots. Every part of her screamed that this was wrong, but she couldn't push the truth away. It was impossible, and yet, he had been there. The bell above the door jingled, snapping Lena back to reality. A young couple entered, talking and laughing softly, unaware of the storm inside her mind. She forced a smile, her face a mask of calm she wasn't sure she could maintain. "Table for two?" she asked, her voice flat. The young woman smiled brightly and nodded. "Please," the woman replied, "right here would be nice." Lena led them to a booth, the mechanical motions of her job taking over as she pushed the image of him aside, at least for the moment. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, her thoughts still stuck on him, still running wild, trying to make sense of the impossible. The man who had died 7 years ago couldn't just be standing there. He couldn't just walk in, as if nothing had happened. It was a cruel joke, a twisted hallucination. She was still in shock, right? Still reeling from the shock of seeing him alive, standing there, like a ghost from her past. But no. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a nightmare. He had looked right at her, spoken her name. He had said her name. Lena grabbed the coffee pot from the counter, pouring herself a cup, though her hands shook as she did. She stared at the dark liquid, trying to focus on something, anything. She had to clear her mind. She needed answers. But where could she find them? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone vibrating on the counter. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her sister, Emily. "Are you okay? I've been trying to reach you all night. Call me when you can." Lena stared at the message, her heart sinking. Emily had known about her husband's death. She had been there, helping Lena with the funeral arrangements, holding her hand through the worst days of her life. Emily had been her rock. She couldn't even begin to imagine what she'd think of Lena now. Without hesitation, Lena dialed her sister's number. The phone rang 3 times before Emily answered. "Lena? Where the hell have you been?" Emily's voice was a mix of concern and frustration. "I've been trying to call you all night." I need to talk to you," Lena said, her voice shaky. "Something happened tonight. I saw him. I saw him, Emily. I saw David." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Lena could hear her sister's sharp intake of breath. She could almost picture her pacing around her apartment, trying to process what Lena had said. "Lena," Emily said softly, "what do you mean? David? That's not possible. He's gone. You buried him." "We buried him." "I know," Lena whispered. "I know, but he was here. He was in the diner. He looked just like he did 7 years ago. Lena, stop." Emily's voice cut through her like a knife. "You're not thinking straight. This isn't real. You're exhausted, and you're still dealing with the grief. I don't know why you think you saw him, but he's not coming back. He's gone." Lena squeezed her eyes shut, tears pricking the edges of her vision. She didn't want to believe what Emily was saying. She didn't want to doubt what she had seen. But a part of her, just a small part, was questioning herself. Could it really be true? Could she have imagined it? Could she have misinterpreted? The man who had walked into the diner? "No, Emily," Lena said, her voice breaking. "It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. I saw him. He spoke to me. He knew my name." Another silence followed, longer this time. Emily let out a deep sigh, as though she were trying to hold herself together. "I don't know what you saw, Lena," she said finally, her voice softer. "But if you need help, you need to talk to someone. I can't handle this on my own. We need to face this together. I know, Lena whispered. I know I need help. But he said something. He said there was something I didn't know. Something I've been kept in the dark about. I don't understand. I need to understand what happened. Her sister didn't respond immediately, as though considering her words carefully. Do you remember anything strange around the time David died? Emily asked cautiously. Anything that might explain this? Maybe someone from the past, someone who could have been involved? Lena's mind snapped back to the night of David's death, the memories rushing forward like a flood. She had never fully understood the circumstances surrounding his passing. The doctors had told her it was an accident, a tragic accident. But she had never been entirely convinced. There were too many gaps, too many things that didn't add up. David had been fine, healthy. There had been no warning signs. And yet, one night, he had gone out for a late walk and never returned. The police had called it a freak accident. He had slipped and fallen on a nearby cliff. The search team had found his body, battered and broken, down below. They had told her that it was quick. That he hadn't suffered. But it never felt right. Something about that night, about everything that had followed, had never sat well with her. She had buried David, yes. She had mourned him, yes. But there had always been questions. Always doubt. I don't know, Lena said softly. I don't know, Emily. But I need to find out. I need to understand. He's alive, and he's telling me there's something I don't know. Something that's been hidden. Her sister was quiet for a long moment. I think you're right. Something doesn't add up. You need to go to the police. You need to get answers. This isn't just about him. It's about what happened to him. What happened to both of you? Lena's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't considered that. What if there was more to David's death than she had been told? What if there was something she had missed? Something hidden from her? She hadn't thought to question it before. The idea of David's death being anything more than an accident had never even crossed her mind. I'll go tomorrow, Lena said, determination creeping into her voice. I'll talk to the police. I'll get the answers. I need to know, Emily. I can't live like this, not with him back. Not until I know the truth. Be careful, Emily warned. If you find something, you might not like what you discover. Ready to unravel the mystery that had been hiding in the shadows of her life for so long. As she ended the call and set her phone down, Lena took a deep breath. She had made her decision. Tomorrow, she would confront the past. She would find out what really happened to David. And maybe, just maybe, she would get the answers she needed. But as the door to the diner opened again, Lena's heart froze. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. It was him. David. He was standing there, right in front of her. Lena's heart raced in her chest as David's figure stood motionless by the door. The clink of a coffee mug slipping from the counter sounded like a distant echo in her mind. The world around her blurred, and her senses were heightened, as if every moment was stretched beyond its natural time. Was she imagining it? Was she dreaming again? She blinked, trying to shake the fog from her mind. But there he was, his face, his posture, everything. It couldn't be real, could it? The man who had died 7 years ago, who she had grieved, who had been buried, was now standing in front of her. Alive. His eyes locked with hers, a familiar, almost painful recognition flashing in his gaze. David? Her voice came out as a whisper, too soft, too unsure. He didn't move. The silence between them was suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Her fingers tingled, her hands still shaking from the previous conversation with Emily, and yet, Everything inside her screamed that this was real. Lena stepped forward, slowly, her feet unsteady. She couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. He had been dead. She had buried him. She had watched the life leave his body. And yet, here he was, as if nothing had happened. "David, how are you? How is this possible?" she asked, her voice cracking. Her brain tried to piece together any logical explanation, any rational thought to bring her back from this nightmare. But nothing made sense. He blinked slowly, his expression unreadable. Then, with a faint smile that seemed almost forced, he said, "I've been away for a while." "Away? Away?" She felt the words like a slap to her face. It didn't make any sense. His voice, his eyes, his presence, they were all exactly the same, and yet it felt like there was something wrong. He was different. Something about him was not the same. It was as though the soul she had once known had been replaced with something colder, darker. Lena didn't know how to react. Her entire world felt like it was tilting off its axis. She could barely breathe, could hardly think straight. But she had to. She had to know the truth. "David," her voice trembled with the weight of his name. "What happened? You died. We buried you. I saw your body. I saw you, gone." His lips twisted, a shadow of pain flashing in his eyes. He took a slow step forward, then another. She flinched, but didn't retreat. What was she supposed to do? Should she run? Should she scream? Or should she stand there and ask the questions that she needed answered, no matter how much they terrified her? "It's not what you think," he said quietly, his words barely audible. "Not what I think. You're standing here, alive." She couldn't hold back the frustration any longer. "How is this possible, David? How are you here? What happened to you? Please, just tell me." David's gaze softened, and for a moment, he seemed like the man she had loved, the man she had lost. But that moment was fleeting. His expression hardened again, and he took another step closer. "I'm not who you think I am," he whispered. Lena's pulse quickened. What did that mean? Not who she thought he was. What did that mean about the man she had buried all those years ago? Was this a stranger? Or was it really him, but changed? Before she could ask another question, he held up a hand. "I can't explain everything right now, Lena. But there are things you need to understand. Things about the night I died. The night. The night he died." That night had haunted her, had been etched into her memory like a scar that wouldn't heal. She had never been able to forget the details, the way the police had come, the way they had told her that he'd fallen from a cliff. The way they had said it had been an accident. But she never believed it. Not completely. Lena stepped back, her hands instinctively clutching the edge of the counter as her legs felt weak. "What do you mean? What happened? What are you talking about?" David's face twisted in pain, his eyes looking away briefly as if searching for something. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost a whisper, as though afraid someone might overhear. "The accident was no accident." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "What? What are you saying?" "It was planned. My death. They made it look like an accident, but it wasn't." He glanced around the diner nervously, then stepped closer to her. "I don't have much time. But you have to listen to me. You have to understand what really happened." "Who?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who did this to you? Who wanted you dead?" He looked at her with eyes that seemed older than she remembered. His expression hardened again, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's not about who, Lena. It's about why. Why they wanted me gone. Why they've been hiding the truth from you." Lena's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. But it felt like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, impossible to complete. She tried to steady her breath, to focus on his words, but the more he spoke, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. "How do you know all of this?" she asked, her voice thick with disbelief. David shook his head, his face clouded with regret. "Because they didn't just take me. They took something else. Something more important. Something that ties me to this, something you don't know." Lena's eyes widened, the implication of his words sinking in slowly. "What do you mean? What did they take?" He reached out, taking her hand in his. It was cold, colder than it should have been. Lena flinched at the chill, but she didn't pull away. "Lena, you don't know it yet, but you've been part of this all along. You've been in the dark, and now, you're going to have to face the truth." His words were like a slap to her face. She had been in the dark? She had been part of this? She had always thought of herself as an innocent bystander in the tragedy of his death. But now, the lines between what she had known and what she had been kept from knowing began to blur. "I don't understand," Lena whispered. David's grip on her hand tightened, and he pulled her toward the door. "We don't have much time. They're watching. They'll be coming for me again. For us." "Who? Who's coming for you?" Her voice rose with panic, but David silenced her with a glance. "They're the ones who were behind it all. The ones who orchestrated my death. The ones who have been pulling the strings from the shadows." He let out a sharp breath. "I've been trying to keep you safe. But it's not over. It's only just begun." Lena's mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But everything about his presence, about the way he spoke, made her believe him. She could feel it deep inside, an unshakable certainty that this was just the beginning. Whatever was happening, whatever game was being played, it was bigger than anything she had ever imagined. David let go of her hand, taking a step back. "I need you to trust me. But you have to be ready. Ready for the truth." The diner's fluorescent lights flickered above them, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tension in the air thickened, and Lena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What truth? What was he about to reveal? And more importantly, what had he been running from? Lena stood frozen, her mind still processing the words David had just spoken. She could barely understand what was happening. The man she had buried, the man she had mourned, was standing in front of her, alive and with a story so unbelievable that it seemed like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "David, please, you need to explain." Her voice was shaky, raw with the desperation of someone who had just been thrust into a world of confusion. "You're telling me that you were never dead? That everything I've known for the last 7 years, everything I've believed, is a lie?" David didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around, his eyes darting toward the windows, as if he were expecting someone to come bursting through the door at any moment. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in his demeanor was enough to send a chill running down her spine. "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I had to die. It was the only way to get away from them. To keep you safe." "Safe?" Lena's brow furrowed in disbelief. "What do you mean, keep me safe? You faked your death to protect me? From what? Who?" David's eyes flickered with a brief flash of pain, but he quickly masked it, his face becoming unreadable once more. "You weren't supposed to be involved in any of this. But they got to you, Lena. They've been watching you, even before I disappeared. They knew how much you meant to me. They knew I would do anything to protect you. And now," he sighed, rubbing his temples as though the weight of what he was about to say was too heavy to bear. "Now, they think I've betrayed them." "Betrayed them?" Lena's voice caught in her throat. "Who are they? What are you talking about?" David took a step closer to her, his face a mixture of regret and determination. Lena, there's a group, a powerful group, that operates in the shadows. You won't find them in any history book. You won't find their names in any record. They've been manipulating events for years, long before we met. And when they found out I knew too much, they decided to make me disappear. Lena's head spun. What was he saying? A group operating in the shadows? Manipulating events? It sounded like something straight out of a conspiracy thriller, but David's words carried a weight that made it impossible to dismiss as fantasy. I don't, she cut herself off, frustrated and overwhelmed. I don't know what you want me to believe. I've been living in the real world, David. I've been paying my bills, going to work, grieving for you. And now you're telling me that all of it was just some kind of elaborate cover-up? David nodded grimly. Yes. It was all a lie. And now you're in the middle of it, whether you like it or not. Lena stared at him, trying to process his words, but it felt like trying to grasp fog with her bare hands. She couldn't understand. She didn't want to understand. This was a nightmare. But David wasn't acting like he was caught in some delusion. He seemed certain. His voice held the weight of someone who had lived through something terrible. So, you just vanished? You let me think you were dead? I buried you, David. I mourned you. I moved on. How could you do that to me? Her voice broke at the end, and she felt her emotions spill over. All the pain, the anger, the heartbreak she had carried for years was flooding back in an instant. I didn't want to do it, David said quietly. But I had no choice. I had to disappear to protect you, to keep you safe from the people who would have killed you if they knew you were connected to me. Lena wiped her tears away, trying to steady herself. She took a deep breath, her chest tight with the weight of everything he was telling her. But if this is true, if they were after you and now they're after me, what are we supposed to do? How do we stop them? David's eyes flickered with a mix of sorrow and something else, something darker. We can't stop them. Not on our own. But we can try to expose them. I've been working on it for years, Lena. I've been gathering evidence, trying to find a way to take them down. But it's hard. They have eyes everywhere. They've been watching you, watching me, for years. Lena was silent, trying to wrap her head around what he had said. She had never suspected anything like this. Sure, there had always been something off about the whole situation with his death. But she never imagined it would lead to something like this, something so vast, so terrifying. So, what now? She asked, her voice shaking. What do we do now? David hesitated, his expression clouded with doubt. I don't know. But I think we have to find the people who can help us. The ones who've been trying to bring down the group that has been controlling everything. They're the only ones who can help us fight back. Lena nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. This was insane. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. But as she looked at David, looked at the man who had once been her husband, who had once been her entire world, she realized that he wasn't the same person she had known. The person standing before her now was changed. His eyes held a haunted look, as though he had seen things that had shattered his world and left him broken. We need to go, David said suddenly, his voice urgent. Now. Go? Where? To who? Lena asked, confusion bubbling up in her throat. David glanced around quickly, his eyes scanning the room as if he were waiting for something, or someone. We don't have much time. They know I'm alive. They'll be coming for me soon. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Who? Who's coming for you? I don't know their names, David said, his voice grim. But they won't stop until they silence me. They think I know too much. They think I can expose them. Lena stood still, her mind a blur of emotions. She had no idea what to do, what to believe. But the look in David's eyes told her one thing: he was in danger. And if he was in danger, then so was she. "We need to leave now," David repeated, urgency in his voice. Lena nodded slowly, though her hands felt cold and her legs were shaky. "Where will we go?" David hesitated before answering. "I have a safe place. A place where we can hide for now, until we figure out what to do." Lena followed him out of the diner, her mind racing. Every instinct she had told her to turn back, to get away from this madness, but she couldn't. She couldn't turn her back on him, not when the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. As they stepped into the night, the weight of everything began to settle over her. There was no turning back now. Whatever they were about to face, whatever danger lay ahead, they had to face it together. And Lena didn't know what that would mean. But she was about to find out. Lena's mind was spinning as she followed David through the dark alley behind the diner. Every step she took seemed to echo, adding to the heavy silence that enveloped them. The world she knew, the one she had lived in for the last 7 years, felt like it had been torn apart. She had buried her husband, mourned him, and yet, here he was, alive and telling her things that sounded impossible, things that made her question everything. As they reached the end of the alley, David stopped suddenly, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. She looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "What is it?" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "What's wrong?" David's eyes were scanning the street ahead of them, his face tense. His gaze flickered back to her, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't know how much time we have, Lena. They know we're together now. They'll be looking for us." Lena's heart sank. "Who are they, David? Who is after us?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled her closer into the shadows, his hand tightening around her wrist. "I can't tell you everything. Not yet. But the people I'm talking about," he hesitated. "They've been operating in the background for years. They control things that people don't even realize. Governments, corporations, organizations, they pull the strings. They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden." "Why did you fake your death?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "Why not just disappear and leave me out of it?" David's face hardened. "I never wanted to drag you into this. But they found out about you, Lena. They knew I cared about you, and they used that against me. They made sure I was erased from the world. They made sure you thought I was dead." "Why?" Lena's voice cracked. "Why would they want you dead?" David looked down, as if struggling to find the right words. "Because I knew too much. I stumbled onto something that could expose them. And once I did, I was a threat. To them, anyone who knows their secrets is a liability." Lena stared at him, trying to digest everything he was saying. It was too much. Too much for her mind to process all at once. "What did you find, David? What is it that you know?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, battered envelope. He handed it to her, his eyes intense. "Take this. You need to see it for yourself." Lena took the envelope from him, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a collection of photographs, grainy, black and white images of what looked like high-level meetings, people in suits shaking hands with unfamiliar faces, their identities obscured by shadows. But the more she flipped through the photos, the more she realized that some of the faces were familiar. There were politicians, CEOs, and military figures, all seemingly connected to one another. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David's expression was grim. "This is just the surface, Lena. What you're holding is only a fraction of the evidence. I've been trying to gather more, trying to figure out how deep it goes." But every time I get close to something, they shut me down. They shut everyone down who tries to get too close. Lena looked at the photos again, her mind racing. What kind of conspiracy was this? Who were these people? And why did David, her husband, know so much about them? As if sensing her confusion, David continued. There's more, Lena. Much more. But I can't do this alone. I need your help. Lena looked up at him, her heart pounding. What do you mean, help? I need you to trust me, he said quietly. I've been working on something for a long time now, and I'm close to breaking this wide open. But I need someone on the inside, someone who can help me connect the dots. Lena felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She had spent years grieving for David, only to have him show up out of nowhere with a story that was so far-fetched it seemed unreal. And now, he was asking her to help him expose a dangerous group of people who had been hiding in the shadows for years? I don't know if I can do this, she said, her voice filled with doubt. I don't know what you want from me. David stepped closer, his eyes pleading. Lena, you've already helped me more than you realize. Just being here, being with me, is helping me. You don't have to do anything more than just stand by me. We can figure this out together. Lena's mind was in turmoil. She didn't know who to trust anymore. David had been a stranger to her for so long, and now he was asking her to jump into a world of danger and deception that she could hardly even comprehend. I don't know, David, she said, shaking her head. I don't know if I can go through with this. I don't know if I'm strong enough. David's hand reached out, cupping her face gently. You are, Lena. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. We're in this together. Lena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She had lost him once before, had buried him, mourned him, and now, she had found him again, only to discover that everything she knew was a lie. Everything she had believed about her life, her future, was crumbling beneath her. I don't know what to do, she whispered. David's expression softened, his voice low. We take it one step at a time. I have a plan, but I need your help. We can expose them, Lena. We can bring them down. Lena looked at him, her mind still racing, but something inside her stirred, a spark of hope, of defiance. Maybe this was the moment. Maybe this was what she had been waiting for all these years. A chance to fight back. To uncover the truth. But just as she was about to speak, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance cut through the silence. David's eyes shot wide open, his hand jerking her back into the shadows. They're here, he muttered, his voice tense. We don't have much time. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Who? David's eyes met hers, filled with urgency. Them. The people who want to keep the truth buried. Lena's breath caught in her throat. It was happening. Whatever this was, whatever David had dragged her into, it was real, and it was dangerous. As the car drew closer, David pulled her closer, his hand gripping hers tightly. We have to go now, Lena. Trust me. And with that, they disappeared into the night, into a world of secrets and lies that neither of them could escape. Lena couldn't stop shaking. The events of the last few days had completely shattered everything she thought she knew about her life, and now, standing in the middle of a secret underground facility, she felt a mix of fear, confusion, and determination. David had led her to this place, somewhere deep beneath the city, where the truth about the conspiracy he had been investigating would finally be revealed. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure: once the secrets hidden here came to light, there would be no going back. The journey had been relentless, filled with close calls, dead ends, and moments of terror. They had barely escaped from the people who were chasing them. But David had been adamant. We're getting closer, he had told her, even when they were running from gunmen, even when they had to hide in safe houses and change their identities. The truth is almost within reach. Now, they were standing at the entrance to a cavernous, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with high-tech equipment and monitors that flickered with data Lena couldn't even begin to comprehend. The air was thick with the smell of machinery and metal. This was where the shadows had gathered, where the people responsible for the conspiracy David had uncovered operated in secret. David turned to her, his face serious. "We're about to expose them. This is the moment, Lena." Lena swallowed hard. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, but there was no turning back now. "What's next?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. David nodded toward a console at the far end of the room. "That's where the files are. Everything. The names, the connections, the evidence that can bring them down." Lena hesitated, her mind racing. "But what if we can't get it all? What if they know we're here?" David's gaze hardened. "They won't stop us. Not now. We've come too far." With a deep breath, Lena nodded. She had come this far because of him, because of the bond they had once shared. And now, she had to see this through. For both of them. David led her to the console, where rows of encrypted files appeared on the screen. As he typed rapidly, Lena could feel the weight of the moment. Every keystroke was a step closer to exposing the truth. Every second they spent in this room brought them nearer to the answers she had been craving. But there was something else, something deep in her gut, that told her this final revelation would be far bigger than she had ever imagined. "Got it," David said, his voice tense but triumphant. "These are the names. The list of everyone involved. The ones pulling the strings." Lena stared at the screen, her heart pounding as she read through the names. The list was long, far longer than she had expected. And among the names were people she knew. High-profile politicians, business leaders, and powerful figures whose faces she had seen in the news. They were all connected in ways that defied logic, involved in schemes that stretched across governments, corporations, and shadow organizations. It was more than just a conspiracy, it was a global web of corruption, manipulation, and control. Lena's hands trembled as she absorbed the information. This is unbelievable," she whispered. "How could they have gotten away with this for so long?" David's expression darkened. "Because they've controlled everything. They've erased anyone who got too close to the truth. But now, we have the proof. We have everything we need to expose them." Just as David was about to download the files, a sudden noise echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Rapid and growing louder. Lena's heart skipped a beat. They had been discovered. The people who had been hunting them, the ones who had made sure David was erased from the world, were here. David's eyes widened in realization. "They're too close. We don't have time." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "What do we do?" David's jaw clenched. "We have to go. Now." He grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the exit. But before they could reach the door, it slammed open with a violent force, and armed men flooded into the room, their weapons drawn. Lena's heart raced as she looked at the men, their faces cold and unfeeling. The truth they had uncovered had just become the most dangerous thing in the world. And now, it was clear, these men weren't going to let them leave with the evidence. "David!" Lena cried, her voice rising in panic. "What do we do?" David's face was grim, his hand still holding hers tightly. "Stay close. Whatever happens, don't let go." The men stepped forward, their leader, tall and imposing, pointing a gun directly at David. "You've gone too far, David," the man said in a low, menacing voice. "This is where it ends." Lena's mind raced. This was it. They had the evidence, but now they were trapped. The people who had orchestrated everything were closing in, and there seemed to be no way out. But then David did something Lena didn't expect. He smiled, just a brief, knowing smile. "I don't think so," he said quietly. In that moment, the room seemed to shift. David's hands moved in a blur, typing something quickly on the console, and suddenly, the monitors surrounding the room lit up with live footage. The faces of the men standing before them appeared on the screens, their identities exposed for all to see. Lena gasped. "How?" David didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the leader, his eyes filled with resolve. "You've been compromised. All of you. The world will know who you are. It's already too late." The leader's face twisted in fury, but before he could react, David hit a final key, and the entire system shut down. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Lena's heart was pounding in her chest as she heard the sound of the men scrambling, cursing, trying to regain control. But it was too late. The information they had been trying to protect had already been broadcast. The world would know the truth. David took Lena's hand again, his grip firm. "We're not done yet. But this is a start. The world will know what they've done." Lena looked at him, her mind still reeling. She had thought she was just a waitress in a small town, living a quiet life. But now, she was a part of something bigger than anything she could have ever imagined. And the truth? It was finally out. David turned to her, his face softening. "Thank you, Lena. You've been incredible. You've helped me more than you know." Lena shook her head, still in disbelief. "I never asked for any of this. But I'm glad you're alive, David. I'm glad we could do this together." As they walked toward the exit, the world outside felt different, shifting, uncertain. The storm was far from over, but the first rays of dawn were beginning to break through the darkness. The truth had been revealed, and there was no going back. But as Lena stepped out into the daylight, she realized something important. Sometimes, the only way to survive, to find hope, was to uncover the truth, even when it seemed impossible. Even when the odds were stacked against you. And sometimes, the most unbelievable stories are the ones that change the world.